The GNU fails spectacularly at tabling its first budget. Is this just the normal course of democratic events in a coalition country, or a fiscal crisis? Let's dive in. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. If you're new around here, I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis videos like this. My. We were all sitting comfortably in South Africa expecting a calm day, and then we heard that the tabling of the budget would have to be postponed in an unprecedented way. I want to take you to Speaker of the National Assembly, Togo Didiza, as she broke this shattering news to the nation.
We were informed by the leader of government business, as it is the process in terms of the communications between ourselves and the executive, that while today we've been gathered here to actually have the Minister of Finance presenting the budget to this august house, that there has not been agreement in terms of parties in the executive to actually find one another in proposals of the budget. And the executive therefore decided, as some of you already know, and as your whips have said in our discussion, some things that have already been on the media about where there are possible increases and where different parties, as well as members of the communities, perspective on those proposed increases were saying. And Cabinet therefore decided not to come and do a presentation of the budget and allow themselves enough time to relook at the budget and come back to this house in March at the time at which they will inform us.
So what does this really mean? Well, there's a long process for tabling and then eventually passing a budget. This is the first hurdle where the Minister of Finance puts a budget before Parliament, and then it goes through various processes and committees where it's debated. There are actually two bills that come from this. The Division of Revenue Bill, which is a bill which effectively talks about how the national government will divide revenue between the provinces and local government. And then there's the Appropriations Bill, which is about how national departments get funded. Of course, the budget is also about how the government will raise revenue, and that seems to be a major bone of contention as this VAT proposal. VAT is value-added tax on all kinds of goods and services, and effectively it's a tax that you pay as a citizen. And there seems to have been a major fallout on how government would raise revenue to fund its budget. There is a deeper process, and the budget has been postponed, the tabling of the budget, to the 12th of March. And in this video, we're then going to analyze all of this, explain what some of the reactions were to this unprecedented postponement, look at some of the political implications, and then also talk about the economic implications, because quite frankly, it's shameful that South Africa finds itself in this position, and I'll explain why. So let's start by talking about some of the political fallout. I want you to have a look at what opposition leaders said in response to this shock announcement. Let's take a look first at EFF leader Julius Malema.
Thank you very much, Speaker. We must all know that this is unprecedented, and this is not a practice that we want to set for this Parliament. It is going to be your legacy, Speaker, that during your tenure, Parliament could not debate and adopt budget. We are saying to you, you are denying this body an opportunity to be receiving a budget, debate it, accept it, or reject it. You are now subjecting the budget of South Africa to party politics when the budget is supposed to be above party politics. Let the budget be presented here and let Parliament decide that this is the decision that we are taking as Parliament, or whether to accept or not. You cannot come here and say confidently that the parties in the executive are not agreeing. What is that? We don't have parties in the executive. We've got the executive. The executive must come here and present the budget, and this parliament must decide whether we adopt that budget or not. You are denying the people of South Africa to see what is happening in this government. There is no government. It has collapsed. It has no capacity to present a budget. Thank you.
That was the EFF. I think Julius Malema was spot on that. Parliament is ultimately the place where a budget is decided. But let's have a look at what the MK party had to say.
Now for us, this day is actually quite a shocker. We are really shocked. This is in the past 30 years, to have a day like this is a serious indication of the crisis that this country is facing. This country has got no leadership. This is what we are facing. We are saying, if we say we have democracy, let democracy come and exercise itself here. This is a theater of politics. Let the Minister of Finance come and say whatever I wanted to say. We don't want to hear rumors. We hear very disturbing rumors that the VAT would have been increased by 2%. In other words, we hear rumors that this ANC-led government wanted to impoverish our people. We have no sympathy with that. The minister must come here and say what he wanted to say, and then we'll deal with it here.
That was what we heard from the opposition parties, but let's take a look at what some partners in the GNU said. And in particular, I'm very interested in what the DA had to say about this. Let's have a look at their representative.
Madam Speaker, contrary to what some of the opposition parties have said, what is happening here today is actually showing two factors that should create immense confidence in what is happening in this country. The first is that Parliament is not a laughing stock, but that Parliament is no longer a rubber stamp to bad policies that will cripple our economy. And the second message that should go out to the markets and to the people of South Africa, Madam Speaker, is that the GNU does not consist only of one political party. Madam Speaker, therefore, the DA supports this postponement, and we hope that the executive will use this opportunity and this time to consider all the proposals on the table, especially the DA ones, so that when we hear a budget that gets put before this House, that it will be a budget of growth that will put our economy on the path of recovery and that will create jobs for the people of South Africa that they so desperately need. Madam Speaker, if that is the result, then the DA is absolutely willing to wait for a short while to hear a pro-growth budget. And therefore, we will support this postponement, but with a clear message to the executive, and particularly to our partners in the GNU, that you are not alone in the GNU, that we have an equal say, and that we will continue to fight for every single person in this country, most particularly the poor. We support this postponement.
So we can talk about the economics of this a little bit later, but firstly, I want to talk about the political implications. Now, there has been a scramble on both the side of the ANC and the DA to take charge of this narrative. But quite frankly, I don't think this is a victory for either of them. Firstly, South Africans voted, we elected a government, and we expect the government to work efficiently and be able to table its budget timeously. Now, the fact that this government, no matter who the parties may be within the government, have failed to table a budget is on them. I quite frankly don't care whether the DA supported this or the ANC supported that. The fact is that collectively, the government has failed to table a budget. And when the government fails, instead of taking collective responsibility as the executive of the country, we then have parties breaking apart and then serving their own internal interests without actually accounting to the South African people for the power that we have given them. But let's start with the ANC. I just don't buy this idea that there was internal criticism. And the ANC has said that its own ministers have criticized this budget and that's why it was withdrawn. Well, in that case, then why is the ANC internally divided? We had an election, we had a manifesto, there have been several months to prepare this budget. Why can't the ANC come to a firm decision? And that also begs the question, Why was the budget tabled in the first place? Why did it have to unceremoniously be removed at the final hour if the ANC was opposed to it? So we're being lied to, I'm afraid to say. Someone took the decision to table the budget. Someone told Parliament that it could happen. Someone typed out and printed that budget, which has now been removed from embargo. So if the ANC was opposed to it, then why was it even printed and written and tabled? So, the ANC can't have its cake and eat it. It can't say, well, here's the budget that other parties disagree with, but we also disagreed with it at the same time, but we're also tabling the budget. This kind of incoherence, just internally, is extremely damaging. And quite frankly, the ANC needs to get its house in order. Otherwise, what's the point of having a party which is the biggest party in the GNU if even that party can't agree on basic things like how we're going to raise revenue to fund whatever agenda is out there, and we don't even have a coherent agenda for this government yet. As for the DA, kudos to them for, standing up against this VAT increase, which would be a terrible idea and may provoke serious civil unrest, as we've seen in other parts of the continent when taxes are raised on ordinary citizens by a government that is failing to ensure growth. But then again, the DA is part of this government. So I don't see how they celebrate their own government failing to table a budget. Yes, we've seen them crowing about them finally asserting their authority, and it's good to see that the DA has finally found a red line beyond which the ANC can't step. And yes, the decision to oppose a VAT increase is good, and thank goodness, the DA feels that way. But the DA is part of this government, and their government is just stuttering along. Now, I've been saying this for a long time, and hopefully people will start hearing me more loudly and more clearly, because on this channel, I signaled that the budget was going to be a big and a tricky moment for this GNU. We don't have a government that has a substantive agenda. What are this government's policies? What is it aiming to do? How's it going to address the growth crisis? How's it going to address unemployment? How's it going to address inequality? How's it going to address the water crisis that is engulfing South Africa? How's it going to address inequality, poverty? How's it going to address apartheid spatial planning? Where are we going with this government? We don't know. We have these bland statements about unity and, there'll be a dialogue one day and there's no date for the dialogue. We're 8 months into this government and we don't have an agenda or a budget to fund that agenda. And at some point, we as citizens need to stop having the wool pulled over our eyes and start demanding that this government actually comes up with coherent plans. Because otherwise, my fear, and I say this without any fear of contradiction anymore, is that we're going to have 5 years of this, of division and the DA saying one thing and the ANC saying another thing and muddling through and never actually making any decisions, because this is going to be a cabinet of appeasing different factions, a cabinet of endless consultation, a cabinet of delay and denial. And that is not going to serve the South African people. Quite frankly, let's have a decisive government. Even if it makes the wrong move, at least it's making moves, and those moves can be corrected down the line. But a government that doesn't even know how to make a move or fund the moves that it doesn't know that it's making is a very dangerous moment in a time where the country needs firm leadership to navigate us out of these multiple economic and social crises that we face. Before I spoke about the economy, we've got a crime crisis. We've got a gender-based violence crisis. We've got a social crisis. We've got social discord growing in South Africa. We need to find a government that can bring the country together rather than increasing the anxiety. And so I don't think this is a political victory for anyone in the GNU. It's certainly not a political victory for the ANC. And while it may be a victory for the DA over the ANC, it's not a victory for the government which the DA serves either. As for the other smaller parties, the UDM, which is even in this coalition, apparently wasn't even told that there was going to be a postponement. So the last minute nature of this, I'm afraid, cannot be patched up by people saying, well, this is the way a democracy goes, and no. This is not the way democracy goes. Democracy is when people vote for things and then the government delivers those things that people vote for. There have only been a few examples where democratic states fail to table budgets on time. It's not the norm. It's the exception. And we don't know how long this delay is going to last. Now, we've got this 3 to 4 week delay, which is extremely long, but then what? What if there's still no agreement? Or what if they agree on the VAT thing and then they disagree on something else? So it creates anxiety. It's last minute. And we're told by the ANC's chief whip, speaking to Oli Mgambi on Newsroom Africa last night, that cabinet was meeting all the way as late as yesterday morning, the morning of the tabling of the budget. So I'm just not sure why things are being left so last minute. And is this the way that other decisions are being taken? Are we waiting till the last minute to find consensus? So I think this raises serious questions. And if as citizens we rest on our laurels and we assume that someone is behind the wheel, we might wake up 5 years later and realize that, you know what, this was the first sign that this government is not in a position to take the decisions it needs to take to get us out of these various crises we face. Now, I want to have a look at exactly how opposition parties then cast this. So let's take a look then at what John Steenhuisen had to say outside Parliament about the DA asserting its authority within the coalition.
The parties in the GNU are not yet settled on the budget that would speak to a growth, jobs and economic advancement agenda. There were some concerns around some of the proposals in the current budget that members of the GNU felt were not in line with the growth agenda in South Africa. And so our interactions as parties to the GNU decided to postpone today's budget and to come back to Parliament with a budget that we think better reflects the growth and jobs agenda, and which also takes into consideration the plight of the people of South Africa who are suffering under an incredibly high cost of living crisis, a huge unemployment crisis. And what we want to do is to come back with a budget that will answer all of those questions, but also give South Africans hope that there is now a big move forward under the government of national unity to fix the economy, to create jobs, and to ensure that we can combat the high cost of living.
Was the contestation over the VAT?
The VAT was, of course, one of the matters, and I think that's been played out in the media over the last few weeks, last week, and it obviously was a very key point for me, if I wear my hat as the leader of my party. Very clear position from my party that we couldn't in good conscience support a 2% VAT increase given the current economic circumstances in South Africa, and that we need to look at more innovative ways that are more pro-growth to be able to get the economy moving, to create jobs and to end the poverty. Those are the key determinants of the medium-term development plan and objectives of them, and we need a budget that speaks to those key objectives. And I think it's a healthy sign that there are now different voices around the table, and that those voices must find each other now before a budget is tabled. And it's not just a my way or the highway situation, and that other parties' views and opinions need to be taken into consideration. And I think that's a healthy sign. So while it's not the most ideal situation today, I think it is absolutely the right decision that's been made so that we can come back with a budget that's going to have buy-in and support of all of the parties into the GNU, and which we can all get behind, and in doing so get South Africa behind it.
What does the pro-growth budget look like for South Africa, particularly in regards to VAT? What direction does that go?
A pro-growth budget doesn't hurt the poorest of the poor. A pro-growth budget doesn't increase the burden on the middle class. A pro-growth budget looks at those key elements that are required and reforms that are required to get the economy moving forward in a more bold way.
So it lowers VAT, it keeps VAT at current levels?
It certainly doesn't raise VAT to a position where South Africans are no longer able to afford, and they cut back on expenditure, and then you end up with inflationary pressures as a result of that. What we need to be doing is taking the big, bold decisions that are going to be required to move the country forward. That's going to mean some reforms. We're going to have to be more assertive around port concessions, around rail concessions. I think that the world and investors locally and South Africans now expect bold, determined action. I think we've had 2 to 3 decades of promises of jobs, promises of growth, but those things don't materialize by wishing them into being. They are determined by medium-term development plans and budgets that speak to those. And I think it's a responsible decision that's been taken today. I think the Minister of Finance has made a responsible decision. I think the GNU has made a responsible decision to go back and come back and present South Africa with a budget that South Africans can look at and see, I can now see the pathway to growth. I can see the pathway to jobs, and I can see the pathway to a better economy for my country.
So look, I think that's good, and I am vehemently opposed to this VAT increase, but like I say, the DA also needs to realize that they bear some responsibility for a government failing to table the budget. Why weren't they able to negotiate this earlier? Now, in a previous episode, I spoke about how opposition parties have seemed to be in internal disarray. We've seen the EFF and how major founders of the party have left. We've seen the MK party facing serious problems with internal disputes and public spats that are detracting from its broader agenda. But this kind of thing makes the opposition look coherent again. And I thought that Julius Malema's statements outside of Parliament really vocalized sentiment across the public board and public dissatisfaction with the shambles that we saw in Parliament. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
Well, the postponement of budget today has rendered Parliament useless. It has got no authority because budget, whether you agree on it or not, you must bring it here so that it can be debated and ultimately adopted. So there is no government. Because if you don't adopt budget, it's clear the government has collapsed. Today we have witnessed the government of national unity, a coalition, grand coalition of DA and ANC, collapsing in front of South Africa. Something that we said to all of you, that it will not last. We will never agree to increase of 2% on VAT from 15% to 17%. And that's why they are scared to come here, because it will be rejected. It is on the budget proposal that was withdrawn that he wants to increase the VAT from 15 to 17%. And that is where the fundamental disagreements are. And we said, bring it here. Let the people of South Africa hear what is the actual disagreement. Then you know that indeed the EFF is reasonable by demanding that this budget must be rejected. Parliament's role is to accept or reject.
Okay, so having reflected on what this means politically and within the GNU, let's talk about some of the economic implications of this. Now, we are told in this budget speech that members of the media got that has now been removed from embargo, that government did intend to hike VAT by 2%. And effectively, what they said was they had a number of options. Do they, increase debt? Do they raise taxes on corporations and the rich? Or do they institute this VAT increase? And they chose the VAT increase. Now, the VAT increase is particularly harmful because it affects everyone. Every time you buy something that has VAT associated with it, that increase in price hits your pocket. And this is across the economy and across various services as well. So VAT is probably the most widespread tax you can use. And when you increase VAT, you increase the price on everyone. Now, government and Treasury's response to that is, well, for the poor, we're going to zero rate certain items and we're going to mitigate the damage. But you can't mitigate your way around a structural increase in the cost to South Africans. Because yes, you can put zero rating on certain food, but then the producer who has to transport that food and make that food has certain inputs down earlier in the value chain that get hit and affected, and the services that move that food to that person get hit. And so this idea that there won't be cost of living implications by singling out certain goods is just laughable. Also, important work in economics as early as the early 2000s by Nobel Prize winning economists Anit Banerjee and Esther Duflo show that poor people don't just consume basic goods, right? Humans don't just consume the things they need to survive. whenever you have a budget, you spend certain portions of that budget, even if you are very poor, on things that make you happy. And so this idea that by zero rating bread and cooking oil, you're going to mitigate the impact on someone's life is just laughable. And we've tried to mitigate our way around poverty. The only way we can mitigate around poverty is to actually have a pro-growth agenda that brings people in poverty out of that poverty. And this mitigation exercise, I'm afraid, isn't going to cut it. Furthermore, not everyone who is in extreme poverty is struggling in this economy. People who were once middle class are falling into more precarious situations. Even people who are doing pretty well are starting to feel this cost of living. Man, in Cyril's economy, even our fellow white South Africans are struggling, guys. It's that real. It's that rough. Like, this VAT increase is going to hit everyone. Like, no one is doing well anymore, except like a few billionaires and maybe some government ministers who are shielded from this stuff. So we are in a crisis, and one thing that we must avoid is following the government narrative on this. How did we get to this crisis where there's no money? We got to this crisis because the same government and the same ANC put us in this crisis by failing to create growth, by losing the unemployment battle, by deepening poverty, by corruption, and by mismanagement and misgovernance, where something like 30 or 40% of water is leaking out of water infrastructure before it even gets to your tap. So you can't misgovern the country for decades and decades and then turn around and say, oops, there's no money, so now we have to tax you. Well, there's no money because you failed. So now who's to blame? Is it we, the normal citizens who are just trying to do our best and make ends meet in many cases? Or is it the government who over decades has now put the country in a fiscal squeeze, and the only way they can get out of it is either further indebt the country, tax people more, or tax everyone more? So we are in a crisis because the same decision makers who have led us into this crisis are now out of ideas, and the only thing they can do is lay waste to the wallets and the purses of ordinary South Africans. And it's not like there aren't creative strategies to generate revenue in South Africa. This is a wealthy country. The fact that a country with this amount of mineral wealth, land wealth, human capital wealth can be in a fiscal crisis is a sorry indictment on those who have governed us for many, many decades. But even beyond our natural endowments and the talent of the South African people, so many countries around the world have become more creative about generating their revenue. I found it interesting watching the Trump administration and the Labour government in the UK recently, because even though they're on different sides of the economic ideological spectrum, they both instituted a similar policy to generate revenue for their states, and that was the creation of a sovereign wealth fund. A sovereign wealth fund is effectively an agglomeration of all the assets of a government. Could be mineral assets, could be assets within state-owned enterprises, it could be property portfolios. It's a way of bringing together assets, consolidating them, and then using those assets in global markets, sweating those assets, getting returns from those assets, and then plowing them back into an economy. But that's a long-term strategy that you have to implement and impose. And the Trump administration, it was one of his first executive orders. The US will now have a sovereign wealth fund. Britain now has a national wealth fund. The Scandinavian economies have done exceedingly well with this policy because of their oil wealth. The Middle Eastern economies that are booming right now, whether it's Qatar, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's the United Arab Emirates, have all succeeded on this platform. So why is South Africa sitting on all this wealth and we don't have a coherent strategy to generate wealth for the population and fill our coffers with extra revenue? Instead, the only thing we can think to do is in the last minute tax everyone who's already struggling more. But we haven't had this kind of leadership, and now the chickens are coming home to roost. So let's get that going. I know there's some bill that's been in the works for years and years about consolidating state-owned entities, and I don't know if it has the wisdom of creating a proper sovereign wealth fund, but South Africa can do that. Now, some people would say yes, but it could be open to corruption and all of that. Well, if we never do anything different because we're scared of corruption, then we'll stay in the same place. But there are ways of ring-fencing funds like that. There are ways of appointing the right people. South Africa has endless financial skill. You know, one thing about South Africa is that our financial markets are extremely sophisticated and developed, and our leaders within the financial sector, whether we talk about banking CEOs or people who are working in private equity funds, these are some of the best in the world. You're telling me we can't get together, get some of these people around the table, create a sovereign wealth fund, invest it well on global markets, and move forward to get more revenue for the South African people? Surely we can do just that. I'm not asking for a lot, just that. We can do that. But let's get on with it instead of just taxing people. There are ways of sweating the government property portfolio. We spoke to the MEC for finance in KZN, who said that he discovered that his provincial government had, I can't even remember how many properties it was. It was like, I think it was 1,300 properties or something that they didn't even know they had. And then once you realize the property portfolio you have, then you can rent out that portfolio, you can rationalize some of the assets that you aren't using, get the revenue in. What if we did just a pure asset register of South Africa's property portfolio, from local to provincial to national government? You're telling me we couldn't find some extra revenue in there? But there's no creativity. It's just National Treasury, I'm afraid, is just, it's out of ideas. And one thing we must guard against is, and here, I mean, I've been very critical of Trump's position on South Africa, which is maddening. But one thing the US is doing, which I think is interesting, is having a look at government expenditure, which is another thing that we could do. I have it on good authority from someone who's seen line items in the South African budget that the amount we spend on bottled water would make your eyes water, right? So are you telling me that if we had a serious look at the budget and we went line by line, nationally, provincially, and at local government level, if government spheres actually worked together for the South African people's interest to say, listen, we're in a crunch, and over the next 3 years, all spheres of government need to find revenue, not squeeze it out of people in tax, but find it within the waste that is in the South African government system. You telling me we couldn't find that waste? But unfortunately, there's either a lack of political will, there's bureaucratic intransigence, there's just a momentum of things must be done the way they've always been done. And then we come up with these slapdash last-minute proposals to just inflict a little more punishment and a little more punishment on the South African people. Now, many people at Treasury like this rhetoric of, well, there are tough choices and we have to make tough choices. That's correct. But the tough choices aren't just economic, they're also socio-political. So you have to experience the tough choices of potential civil unrest if you can't think more creatively about revenue generation as a government. And so, yes, there are tough choices, but the tough choices aren't just tax, VAT, or debt. The tough choices are, if you tax people, well, you might get a few extra billion in the coffers, but at what social cost? At what civil unrest cost? So if we really want to be realists, let's be realists, but let's be realists with a panoramic view of South African society, not just spreadsheets and percentages. So there are ways to generate revenue, and this government of national unity must roll up its sleeves, stop doing PR exercises, and actually find revenue outside of taxing the South African people. And they have 3 weeks to do it. And failing that, maybe this can be failing that, then they must be held accountable for their failures across the board. DA, ANC, UDM, Rise Mzansi, BOSA, IFP, and all the other parties that are in the GNU. This is your crisis, yours. Don't act like now you're opposition parties suddenly. You decided to join government. Now we look to you to find a resolution to this crisis. And of course, the ANC, which is the anchor partner of this coalition. So I'm hoping that this video will be a wake-up call to us as citizens of this country. Because if we keep this laissez-faire attitude and we keep this laid-back attitude towards this government and just say, well, it's the way democracy works and don't worry, everything will be fine, we're going to find ourselves in this position in 5 years again. So, government has three weeks to get its act together on this. And on this channel, we'll be following that very closely. But till then, for me, this is a sign of worry rather than the normal course of democratic events in a coalition country. As always, if you agree or if you disagree, let's have a healthy debate down in the comments. Of course, I'm not always right about things, and this is just a channel where I try to provoke your thought, provoke public debate, and we're always interested and open to other perspectives. By the way, if you're still with us, check out some of our other videos on this channel. We have two kinds of videos on this channel. These videos are where I give you my perspective and my opinion. And as you can see, my opinions can be strong on certain things. Then we have interviews where we bring the perspectives of other people onto the channel. And I sit back and I listen to them and I bring you multiple different perspectives so that at the end of the day or the week or the month, you can listen to different people and make up your own mind on what perspective you believe is the right one on South Africa. So there's a trove of videos on this channel. Hope you check them out. Like, share, subscribe. Get us to 250,000 subscribers. Become a member and you can come to exclusive SMWX events and get exclusive members-only content. And just spread the fire. That's the tagline of this channel. And what it means is spread the word. This channel has grown to over 200,000 subscribers because you tell your friends about it, you tell your family about it, you watch it collectively and you spread the fire. And this channel has grown by word of mouth to one of the most important platforms discussing our country, and it's because of you. So thank you. See you on the next one. Subscribing is easy. There's a button right in the corner of the screen. You don't even have to go out of the video. And keep it locked on SMWX. I hear you.